distributed vSwitches. In this module, I will discuss distributed vSwitches, the difference between our standard vSwitch and the distributed vSwitch. I'll then discuss some of the main features of our distributed vSwitch. Before going into our vSphere web client and configuring our distributed vSwitch to manage our host. So let's just take a couple minutes and go through some of the highlights of our distributed vSwitch. So a distributed vSwitch really provides a central interface for consistently configuring and administering our virtual networking for multiple different hosts in our data center. Okay, so it eliminates our per host network configuration and maintenance. It eliminates that by providing a centralized console where we could manage and monitor our data center networking as a whole. It is similar to our standard vSwitches. It is similar to the standard vSwitches in the sense that it contains both the VM kernel ports and our VM port groups. But our port groups in distributed vSwitches, they are called distributed port groups. Alright. It is different from a standard vSwitch in the sense that it can be centrally managed through vCenter, and it could connect to multiple hosts to manage them rather than managing that networking separately on the host. So once we deploy a distributed vSwitch, the control plane traffic that is managed at the data center level, while the data plane traffic that remains on the host itself. All right. Actually, the VM NIC or the adapters in our ESXi host, they are not removed from that ESXi host in any way. There is a virtual component at the distributed vSwitch level that's called a DV uplink group. And the DV uplink group is really what maps to the physical adapter in our ESXi host. All right. But in our demonstration, we'll get to implement in our distributed vSwitch uplink group and add in our host into that. All right. One thing we should note, however, is implementing distributed vSwitches would require the vSphere Enterprise Plus licensing. Okay, let's take a look at some of the main features of distributed vSwitches compared to our standard vSwitch. So one of the main features of a distributed vSwitch is our management network rollback capability. So we could roll back a configuration change that would disconnect that host management network. So the rollback capability allows us to, or it prevents us from losing management access to that host that we are working on. Secondly, we could back up and restore the configurations. We could do this as a whole. We could back up and restore the configuration as a whole for that distributed vSwitch, or we could also do that at the port group level. Okay. Third in our list here, we have inbound traffic shaping. So let's recall when we discuss our standard vSwitches, we were presented with the capability of doing outbound traffic shaping. With our distributed vSwitch, we could do outbound and inbound traffic shaping. So our distributed port groups, they can be configured to throttle the aggregate bandwidth inbound to our vSwitch. So an ideal use case for this would be for shaping our inbound traffic to our distributed port group. We could use this if we're trying to shape the bandwidth to a VM that's acting as a web server within that particular port group that we're applying this shape into. Next, we could do a per port policy. So recall I would have mentioned in our standard vSwitch discussion that we could apply our security settings and our teaming settings at the distributed port group level with our distributed switches. So apart from applying our policies to the port group level, we can also configure settings, those same settings, security and traffic shaping, on our individual ports, okay, within our distributed port groups. Next, we have NetFlow. We can use NetFlow to monitor the traffic flow in our virtual network, and also to forward the NetFlow information to a monitoring system that we may have, let's say, in our physical network. All right. Next in our list, we have port mirroring. So what port mirroring allows us to do is it allows us to send a copy of a packet that that is passing through our distributed vSwitch. It allows us to send a copy to a monitoring station. So we could send a copy of that packet to a monitoring station without having an intrusion prevention system or an intrusion detection system skewing the data in between there. Okay. Next, we have our link aggregation control protocol. So this is implemented with our distributed vSwitches. And so rather than us manually creating our Ether channel, we could use LACP to negotiate Ether channel back to our physical switches for the purposes of fault tolerance or load balancing. All right. So next, I'll pull up my vSphere web client here, and we'll go through some of these settings here. Okay, so here I have my vSphere web client. In our view here, we'll need to go to our networking view. We'll need to go to our networking view to configure this. The distributed vSwitch is implemented at the data center level. Okay. So we could right-click our data center here and create a new distributed vSwitch. I have two here that I was working with, so let's just minimize this, and we'll go ahead and create a new distributed vSwitch. So if you right-click here, distributed switch, new distributed switch. So let's give this a name. Let's call this DvSwitch 20. The location for this is in our data center 1. Here we'll choose the compatibility for this vSwitch. Sorry. If you're managing ESXi 6.0 hosts, we'll choose this option here. If we had both 5.5 and 6.0, that's when we'll choose this option here for compatibility reasons. So we'll just go ahead and hit next. Okay, so here we have the number of uplinks. All right, the number of uplinks here is the maximum uplinks that we would have on one ESXi host. So let's just say this distributed vSwitch would span across 3 hosts, okay? And each one of those hosts would have a maximum of 8 uplinks. That's where we would want to choose 8 here, okay? By default, it's set to 4. We'll leave that selected. For our network I/O control, if you want to enable that or disable it, by default it's enable. And then our this wizard could go through and create a default port group or a distributed port group. If you leave this option selected, it would create a port group that's called a D port group. So we'll just uncheck this. We don't need it to go ahead and create a port group. We'll manually do that. We hit next. We'll have a little summary of what it's going to do. All right, and then you have some suggested next actions here. So it's suggesting that we create our distributed port group at the end of this, and we add our host into this distributed vSwitch to be managed. Okay, we have our name here, the version, and the number of uplinks, and we have a status on our network IO control. So I'll just go ahead and hit finish here. If you notice at the bottom here, it would go ahead and create this distributed vSwitch. So this is the one that we would have created, DvSwitch 20. Okay, and by default, it would also create a uplink port group. Okay, so this here is a virtual component, the uplink port group. So it's a virtual component that really points to the physical or the VM NIC on our ESXi host. Let's recall those wouldn't be changed. We can't remove the VM NIC from the ESXi host, for example. So this would just point back to that host, okay, or to that host VM NIC. Basically, this distributed vSwitch would be communicating with a hidden switch on our ESXi host. So after we would have migrated our ESXi host network into this distributed vSwitch, we could go ahead and delete that default vSwitch 0, our standard vSwitch in our ESXi host. But at the end of that, this switch would still be communicating to a hidden switch on our ESXi host. So we could go ahead and rename this uplink group. Let's do that actually. Let's call this uplink group 20. Okay. So once we have this uplink group up and running here, we could do a couple things with this. We could go in and edit the settings. We could export the configuration for this. We could go ahead and restore the configuration. And this is one level where we'll be able to do that. We could also do that at the port group level and actually at the distributed vSwitch level too. So let's go ahead and create a couple distributed port groups on this vSwitch. So at this level here, if you were to right click, we'll work with these options just now, adding our host and managing our VM networking. But for now, let's just create a new distributed port group. Okay. So let me just go over back that. So I right click my distributed vSwitch here and then distributed port group. And then we're going to create a new distributed port group. Okay, so we could give this a name here. Let's just leave the default name here. Okay, and the location for this is on our DvSwitch 20. Hit next. We'll leave the static port binding there. Port allocation, if you want this to be fixed or elastic, we could change that here. By default it's elastic, so it would allow the ports to grow as needed. The number of ports in this distributed port group, if we were using or doing network resource pool, we could set that there. And VLAN type. Okay, so let me just hit next here. This would give us a little summary. All right, let's make this a bit more realistic. Okay, so say we are creating this distributed port group for storage traffic. Okay. There we have storage. Let's say we needed another one for our vMotion traffic. All right, so let's call this one vMotion. So under our distributed vSwitch here, we have our port group, our uplink port group, our uplink group, sorry, and we have our two port groups, our storage and our vMotion port group. So let's just go ahead and create one more. Let's just call this one management. Okay, so let's go ahead and bring in some of our hosts here now to be managed. We'll right click our distributed vSwitch and go to add and manage host here. Okay, we could do a few different things here. We could just bring in our hosts. We could manage the host networking. We could remove that host from this distributed vSwitch if it was already added here. And then finally, we could add hosts and manage the networking in our wizard together here. Okay, so for now, let's go ahead and add this host. Okay, and I select next here. I have the option of selecting the host. All right. So let's just say I wanted to bring in ESXi 1. All right. I'll hit OK there. Once we come to the next screen here, we have the option of managing the physical adapter. If you wanted to manage the VM kernel adapters, we could do that here too. We could migrate the virtual machine networking. Okay. So for now, let's just deselect that. And we want to manage our physical adapters. So let's just hit next here. Okay. So here we have it. Add or remove our physical network adapters to this distributed vSwitch. Okay. So recall we created or we renamed this uplink group, uplink 20. So this is our VMNIC 0. This is located in vSwitch, our standard vSwitch 0 on this ESXi host. Okay. So if you were to select this and assign uplink, we could assign this uplink to our distributed vSwitch here. All right, we could do auto assign or just say, okay, we're assigning VMNIC 0 to uplink 1 on our uplink group here. Okay. So take a look at this now. We have our VMNIC 0, which is located in vSwitch 0. It's assigned currently to uplink 1 in the uplink group 20. Okay. If you were to select view settings here, we would have some information on this this VMNIC on the ESXi host. All right. So let's cancel out of that and hit next here. So it will go ahead and analyze the impact that this may have on our ESXi host. All right. So I have a couple other stuff that is running on this host now. I don't want to go ahead and do this. But all we needed to do is hit next here and confirm this. Okay. So let's just go ahead and cancel this. I have another host here that I would have go ahead and migrated the management network and stuff like that from our standard vSwitch to the distributed vSwitch. So I'll go ahead and let you guys have a look at that one. Okay, so once we would have added that host into this distributed vSwitch to be managed, we could go ahead and migrate the networking from that host So let's go through back this wizard again. So if we were to go to manage host networking, okay, and we attach our host here. Actually, we need to attach a host first. So actually, let me go to one of our distributed vSwitch that I actually would have moved over a host to already. So if you were to go to DvSwitch here, and right click on this, add and manage host here. Say we just needed to manage host networking. Say we are trying to migrate over our VM kernel port or management networking. This is where we'll do that. Let's just attach ESXi2 here. Okay. Once we hit next here, say we were trying to migrate over our VM kernel adapters. We will do that under manage VM kernel adapters. Alright. And here we would have the option of moving the networking over from ESXi2 to a particular VM kernel port on this distributed vSwitch, right? So once we would have completed that and go to our ESXi2, this is one that I went ahead and I did that on. I would have migrated the management network from our standard vSwitch 0 to our distributed vSwitch here. If you notice, if under virtual switch on this ESXi host 2, you do not see a standard vSwitch 0 here. So once this is migrated, I went ahead and just deleted that vSwitch on that ESXi host. Alright, so this management network has been migrated. And what we could do also is, before we get into this here, I want to demonstrate how we could go ahead and migrate our virtual machine traffic. Alright, so before we do that, let me just go ahead and create one more distributed port group here. So this is for our virtual machine traffic. We just go ahead and create a new one. Before I demonstrate this, let's go back to one of our virtual machine. Let's go into one of them here. This is a DSL box I have. If I was to go into edit settings for this virtual machine, under network adapter here, I will be able to change the networking for this particular VM. So we could have seen our distributed port group if we had this configured. Our distributed port group shown up here. This is how you would do this individually on each VM. But once you're migrating your networking over to a distributed vSwitch, we could go ahead and migrate all of our virtual machines networking or selected few of our virtual machines. So we'll go under this vSwitch and then to migrate the VM to another network. So here we'll have the option of choosing the source network. So say the source network was VM network there, and then we'll choose our destination network here. Okay, so say we are trying to migrate this over to our VM network that's on our distributed vSwitch here. We'll select that. Alright, if you were to select next here or hit next, we would have the virtual machines that we are trying to migrate from our VM network on our standard vSwitch to our distributed vSwitch port group here. So we could select all of our virtual machine or just a few of them. Okay. So once we select that, select our virtual machine. We'll go ahead and hit next, and that should migrate over our networking from our standard vSwitch to our distributed vSwitch port group. Alright, so let me just go ahead and cancel that out here. Okay, so one last thing I want to demonstrate here is how we could back up and restore our configuration. So say we went ahead, we created our port group, and we have all of that configured. We could go at the port group level here, and we could export our configuration. Okay, we could do the same thing at the distributed vSwitch level. So if you right click the distributed vSwitch 20 here, this is located under settings. So if you go under settings and then export configuration, so we have the option here of exporting the distributed vSwitch and all the port group settings, or just the distributed switch setting. Okay, so it'll just prompt you where you want to store this configuration. Alright, so we went ahead and we exported the configuration there. So say we need to restore back that configuration. We will go back to our distributed vSwitch here setting, and then restore that configuration. And then we'll browse to where we would have stored that and just bring that back in here.